You think a uniform gives you the right to humiliate people? The woman asked quietly, her voice steady enough to make the crowded diner fall silent for just a heartbeat before the breakfast rush swallowed the sound again. The bell above the front door jingled as another customer stepped inside, carrying the cool breeze of an early October morning through a family-owned diner tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat in a working-class neighborhood outside Norfolk, Virginia. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with sizzling bacon, buttered biscuits, and maple syrup filled the room, while waitresses moved carefully between packed booths. Amelia Carter adjusted the name tag on her navy blue apron and balanced 3 heavy plates across her arms with practiced confidence. At 32 years old, she had learned that kindness often arrived before respect, and sometimes respect never arrived at all. Still, she greeted every customer with the same warm smile. "Good morning. Coffee to start?" she asked an elderly couple as she refilled another customer's mug without spilling a single drop. Most regulars knew Amelia by name. They knew she remembered birthdays, favorite breakfast orders, and whose granddaughter had just started college. They also knew she worked double shifts because her husband had spent much of the past year deployed with a Navy Special Operations Unit, leaving her to manage their small home alone. She never complained. She simply showed up every morning before sunrise, tied her apron, and got to work. At exactly 8:17 a.m., a marked police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out, still wearing his dark sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. He walked inside with brisk confidence, the leather duty belt resting heavily around his waist. Several customers nodded politely, but he barely acknowledged them. Amelia approached with a menu, although she recognized him from previous visits. "Good morning, officer. Would you like your usual scrambled eggs and wheat toast?" she asked pleasantly. He did not look up from his phone. "Coffee? Now." "Absolutely. I will have it right out," Amelia replied before hurrying toward the coffee station. At that exact moment, another waitress accidentally dropped a tray near the kitchen entrance. Ceramic shattered across the floor. The sharp crash caused everyone to glance toward the noise. Amelia instinctively stepped over to help clear the broken pieces before another employee slipped. It delayed her less than 30 seconds. When she returned carrying Officer Brooks's coffee, his expression had already hardened. Finally, he muttered loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Amelia gently placed the mug on the table. "I am sorry for the brief wait." Someone dropped. Before she could finish, he abruptly brushed her serving hand away while standing up, causing the coffee to splash across the table instead of reaching him. The movement was sudden enough that several nearby diners gasped. "Slow service," he snapped. "Maybe spend less time chatting and more time doing your job." The room became uncomfortably quiet. Amelia instinctively steadied herself, her breathing controlled despite the sting of embarrassment. She looked down at the coffee dripping across the laminated tabletop before calmly reaching for a clean towel. "I will clean that up immediately, officer," she answered without raising her voice. A retired school principal sitting nearby frowned. "She was helping another employee," he said carefully. Brooks ignored him. "I do not need commentary from civilians." Amelia quietly wiped the table while another customer offered her a sympathetic glance. No one could miss the tension hanging in the room. Yet instead of arguing, Amelia simply continued working with the same professionalism she had shown every customer that morning. Deep inside, she reminded herself of something her husband often said before leaving for deployment. Character shows itself most clearly when nobody else chooses fairness. She took one slow breath, picked up the fresh pot of coffee, and walked toward another waiting table with the same gentle smile she had worn since dawn, unaware that this ordinary morning was about to become the moment that would test not only her dignity, but everyone else's as well. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. Amelia carried the fresh coffee pot toward another booth as if nothing unusual had happened, although her heartbeat still echoed in her ears. Years of working in restaurants had taught her that the fastest way to calm an uncomfortable room was not through arguments, but through quiet professionalism. She greeted a young family waiting near the window with the same gentle smile, filled their cups, and asked whether they needed extra pancakes for the children. The little girl smiled back immediately. That simple moment reminded Amelia that one person's cruelty did not have to define everyone else's morning. Behind her, Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing beside his booth, visibly irritated that the attention had shifted away from him. He glanced around the diner, perhaps expecting people to laugh or support his complaint, but instead he noticed customers returning to their meals in uneasy silence. The retired school principal quietly folded his newspaper while another regular customer shook his head without saying a word. The owner of the diner, Linda Morales, stepped out from the kitchen after hearing about the spilled coffee. She had operated the restaurant for nearly 20 years and knew every employee personally. Looking first at Amelia and then at the coffee covering the table, she calmly asked, "Is everyone all right?" Amelia answered before anyone else could. "Everything is under control. I can clean this up." Linda studied her employee's expression for a moment before handing her another towel. "Take your time." There was no accusation in her voice, only trust. Amelia appreciated that more than anyone realized. Officer Brooks finally spoke again. "Your waitress ignored a customer. That is not exactly professional service." Linda remained respectful. "Sir, she stopped for less than half a minute because broken dishes were on the floor. She was preventing someone from getting hurt." Brooks crossed his arms. "That is your opinion." Amelia quietly continued wiping the table without looking directly at him. She refused to let frustration shape her response. Her husband had once told her that the strongest people were often the ones who never needed the loudest voices. She repeated those words silently while carrying the stained towel toward the service station. In the kitchen, another waitress whispered, "Are you okay?" Amelia nodded gently. "I will be. Let us keep everyone fed." The breakfast rush continued. Orders moved from the grill to the serving window. Plates of eggs, hash browns, biscuits, and fresh fruit disappeared into the dining room. Outside, morning traffic rolled steadily along the four-lane road, while school buses stopped at nearby intersections. Everything looked ordinary again, yet the atmosphere inside remained noticeably different. Several customers watched Amelia with quiet admiration as she continued helping everyone without hesitation. An elderly veteran wearing a faded ball cap slowly stood from his booth and walked to the register before leaving. Instead of speaking loudly, he simply folded a $20 bill into the tip jar and said to Linda, "Please make sure that young lady gets this." Then he tipped his cap respectfully toward Amelia before walking out the front door. Amelia noticed the gesture only after he had already reached the parking lot. She smiled softly, grateful not for the money but for the reminder that decency still existed. Across the room, Officer Brooks watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. For the first time that morning, uncertainty briefly crossed his face. He had expected embarrassment to silence the waitress, yet every quiet act of professionalism seemed to strengthen the respect people felt toward her instead. Amelia returned to her next table carrying a fresh basket of warm biscuits, completely unaware that before the day was over, someone connected to her private life would walk through those same front doors and change the direction of every assumption made inside the diner. The breakfast rush slowly settled into a quieter rhythm as the wall clock crept toward 9 o'clock. Sunlight filtered through the diner windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor while the familiar sounds of silverware, coffee cups, and quiet conversations gradually replaced the earlier tension. Amelia moved from table to table with calm confidence, checking on every customer with the same patience she had shown since dawn. Although the uncomfortable encounter still lingered in her thoughts, she refused to let it influence the care she gave the people around her. Linda quietly approached while helping refill the pie display near the register. "You handled yourself well," she said softly. Amelia offered a grateful smile. "My mother always told me that dignity is something nobody can take unless we hand it over." Linda nodded with quiet respect before returning to the kitchen. Across the dining room, Officer Daniel Brooks remained seated much longer than usual. His untouched breakfast had grown cold while he occasionally glanced toward Amelia, seemingly expecting another mistake that never came. Every order she carried reached the correct table. Every customer thanked her by name. Every child received an extra napkin before making a mess. Every elderly guest was offered assistance before needing to ask. The consistency unsettled him more than any argument could have. Near the front entrance, The bell chimed once again as a delivery driver entered carrying boxes of fresh produce. Amelia immediately held the door open so he could maneuver the heavy-hand truck inside. "Thank you, ma'am," he said with an appreciative smile. "Have a safe day," she replied before returning to the dining room. A young couple seated near the window quietly observed everything. The husband leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She has been nothing but kind since we got here." His wife nodded. Some people wear authority. Other people earn respect. Their words were never intended for anyone else to hear, yet they reflected the quiet shift taking place throughout the diner. Respect for Amelia continued growing naturally, not because she demanded it, but because she never stopped extending it to others. Several minutes later, Amelia stepped behind the counter to answer the ringing telephone. "Good morning, Harbor Family Diner. This is Amelia speaking. How may I help you?" Her voice immediately softened with surprise. "Oh, you are back already?" A gentle smile crossed her face. "I am so glad you made it home safely." After listening for a moment, she laughed quietly for the first time that morning. "Of course, I will save you your favorite booth." She thanked the caller and carefully returned the receiver to its cradle. Linda noticed the change in her expression. "Good news." Amelia nodded. "My husband just landed late last night. His schedule changed, and he is finally coming home after months away. He said he might stop by before reporting to the base this afternoon." "That is wonderful," Linda replied sincerely. "You deserve some good news today." Amelia looked toward the front windows for only a brief moment before returning to work. She had missed her husband through birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays spent apart. Knowing he was finally home filled her with quiet strength she had not realized she needed. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks overheard only fragments of the conversation. The mention of a husband returning from military duty barely registered in his thoughts. To him, it was simply another ordinary detail about another ordinary customer service worker. He finished the last sip of his coffee, reached for the check, and prepared to leave without realizing that the man Amelia was waiting for had spent years serving in one of the most demanding military communities in the country. Within the next hour, two very different worlds would unexpectedly meet inside the same small diner, and the assumptions made that morning would begin to unravel one careful conversation at a time. Officer Daniel Brooks placed several bills beside the untouched plate, stood from the booth, and adjusted the radio clip to his uniform. Without looking toward Amelia, he walked out of the diner and disappeared into the parking lot. The room seemed to exhale all at once after the patrol car pulled away. Conversations gradually returned. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, and the ordinary rhythm of the morning slowly reclaimed the space. Amelia quietly collected the check, wiped the booth clean, and carried the dishes back to the kitchen as though it had been just another difficult customer. Linda watched her for a moment before placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Why don't you take 5 minutes?" she suggested. Amelia smiled gratefully, but shook her head. "I would rather stay busy. It helps me clear my mind." Linda understood. "Then let me know if you need anything." Amelia thanked her and returned to the dining room with another pot of freshly brewed coffee. Around 10 o'clock, the breakfast crowd began thinning. Several regular customers stopped at the register on their way out, offering Amelia encouraging smiles and quiet words of appreciation. The retired school principal who had witnessed the earlier exchange paused beside her. "Young lady," he said warmly, "my students used to think strength meant winning arguments. Life eventually teaches that real strength is keeping your character when someone else loses theirs." Amelia thanked him sincerely. His words settled into her heart more deeply than he could have known. Outside, sunlight reflected across rows of parked cars while a light breeze stirred the American flag flying above the neighboring post office. The peaceful scene felt completely disconnected from the emotional weight of the morning. At exactly 10:24 a.m., a dark blue pickup truck slowly entered the parking lot. It was clean but clearly well-traveled, with road dust still clinging to the lower panels after a long drive. Amelia happened to glance through the front window while carrying a tray of iced tea. Her expression softened instantly. A tall man stepped out wearing faded jeans, worn brown work boots, and a simple gray sweatshirt. His short haircut and calm posture reflected years of disciplined military service, even though nothing about his appearance called attention to it. Before entering the diner, he paused for a moment, taking a slow breath as if appreciating something as ordinary as standing in his own hometown again. When the bell above the door rang, Amelia looked up and froze. The tray remained perfectly balanced in her hands, but tears quietly gathered in her eyes before she could stop them. The man smiled the moment their eyes met. "Hi, sweetheart," he said softly. Amelia carefully set the tray onto the nearest table before walking toward him with quick but measured steps. She wrapped him in a warm embrace that lasted only a few seconds, mindful of the customers around them, yet long enough to erase months of distance. Several regulars smiled at the reunion. Linda wiped away a tear while pretending to organize menus behind the counter. "Welcome home," she called. "Good to be back," the man replied with genuine gratitude. Amelia stepped back, still smiling. "Everyone, this is my husband, Ethan Carter." Ethan greeted the room with quiet humility, shaking hands with a few familiar faces who remembered him from visits before his deployment. No one would have guessed from his relaxed manner that he served in one of the most demanding military communities in the country. He never introduced himself by rank, accomplishments, or assignments. To him, today was not about his career. It was about finally sharing a simple breakfast with the woman he loved after months apart. Amelia led him to the small corner booth she had promised to save during their phone call. As they sat across from one another, she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. Ethan immediately noticed the faint sadness still lingering behind her smile. He did not interrupt the happiness of the reunion by asking questions right away, but after taking one sip, he gently reached across the table and said, "Something happened here this morning, did it not?" Amelia looked into his eyes, realizing that after all these years together, there had never been a moment when he failed to recognize what she was trying so hard to hide. Amelia lowered her eyes for a moment before wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. The warmth against her fingers steadied her breathing. Ethan never rushed her. After years of military deployments and long months apart, he had learned that silence often invited honesty better than questions ever could. She finally looked up and offered a small smile that carried more exhaustion than happiness. "It was only one difficult customer," she said quietly. Ethan listened, without interrupting. Amelia explained how the morning had unfolded, beginning with the broken dishes near the kitchen, the brief delay, the spilled coffee, and the officer's public criticism. She described every moment carefully, never exaggerating and never speaking with anger. When she finished, Ethan remained silent for several seconds. He did not clench his fists or raise his voice. Instead, he reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I am sorry you had to go through that alone," he said. Amelia smiled softly. "I was not really alone. Linda stood by me. The customers were kind. I kept thinking about what you always tell me." Ethan tilted his head. "Character matters most when fairness disappears." She nodded. That helped. Ethan's expression filled with quiet pride. "Then you were stronger than anyone else in the room today." Before Amelia could answer, Linda approached carrying 2 steaming breakfast plates. "These are on the house," she announced with a warm grin. "Welcome home, Ethan." He immediately shook his head. "Linda, I cannot let you do that." She folded her arms playfully. "You can either enjoy breakfast or argue with the owner. Those are your only choices." Everyone laughed, and the tension that had shadowed the morning eased for the first time. Ethan thanked her sincerely before they began eating. Between bites, they spoke about ordinary things that had nothing to do with the unpleasant encounter. Amelia asked about the flight home. Ethan told her about watching the sunrise through the airplane window as it crossed the East Coast. He laughed while describing how one young passenger had insisted on showing everyone drawings of airplanes for nearly an hour. Amelia shared stories about neighborhood customers, the annual fall festival scheduled for the weekend, and the pumpkin decorations now lining Main Street. The conversation felt wonderfully normal, exactly what both of them had missed during months apart. A little boy passing their booth suddenly stopped beside Ethan. "Excuse me, sir," he asked shyly. "My grandpa says you were in the Navy. Is that true?" Ethan smiled warmly. "Yes, it is." "Were you on a big ship?" the boy asked. With wide eyes, Ethan chuckled. Sometimes my job was somewhere else." The boy nodded thoughtfully before returning to his grandparents, apparently satisfied with the mysterious answer. Amelia smiled. "You always make everything sound ordinary." Ethan shrugged gently. "Most people who serve are ordinary people doing their jobs." Linda overheard the conversation while refilling nearby coffee cups. "He has never liked attention," she said. Ethan laughed quietly. "Attention usually belongs to the team, never one person." Neither Amelia nor the customers realized that Ethan had intentionally left out almost everything about his military career. Even his closest neighbors knew only that he served in the Navy. Very few people outside his command understood the demanding selection, years of training, and responsibility carried by those assigned to elite special operations. He preferred it that way. His identity had never been built around recognition, but around service, discipline, and returning home safely whenever possible. As the conversation continued, the front door opened once again. Another police officer entered the diner, removed his campaign hat, and nodded politely toward Linda before looking around the room. His eyes settled on Ethan for just a fraction of a second, and a look of immediate recognition crossed his face. He straightened instinctively, then walked toward the corner booth with measured respect, unaware that his next few words would quietly change the atmosphere inside the diner once again. The second police officer approached the corner booth with an easy smile that immediately caught the attention of several nearby customers. Unlike the tense atmosphere from earlier that morning, his presence carried quiet professionalism rather than authority. He stopped beside Ethan and extended his hand. "Good morning, sir. Welcome home. It is good to see you back in Virginia." Ethan stood and returned the handshake with genuine warmth. "Thank you, officer. It is good to be home." Amelia looked between the two men with mild surprise. "You know each other?" she asked. The officer smiled politely. "Only professionally. We have crossed paths during several community emergency preparedness events near the naval base." Ethan nodded. Officer Michael Hayes has always been supportive whenever local agencies work together. Officer Hayes chuckled. "You are giving me far too much credit." Linda poured him a cup of coffee before he even ordered. "The usual?" she asked. "Please, and thank you." As Hayes sat at the neighboring booth, he glanced toward Amelia with a friendly expression. "I have heard wonderful things about your service here. My wife keeps telling me I should stop by more often." Amelia thanked him with a modest smile before returning to refill another customer's drink. The contrast between the two officers could not have been more noticeable. One had demanded attention through his position. The other earned respect simply by the way he treated people. Ethan quietly observed the dining room while taking another sip of coffee. "This place has not changed much," he said. Amelia smiled. "That is probably why everyone loves it." Linda laughed from behind the register. "We changed the pie flavors. Everything else stays exactly the same." Their conversation was interrupted when the retired school principal, who had remained longer than usual to finish grading papers, approached Ethan's table. "Young man," he said kindly, "your wife handled herself with remarkable grace today. You should be proud of her." Ethan looked toward Amelia, who was helping an elderly couple gather their takeout containers before answering. "I already am." The older man nodded with satisfaction before quietly leaving the diner. Officer Hayes had overheard enough of the conversation to sense that something unpleasant had occurred earlier. He waited until Amelia stepped into the kitchen before asking gently, "Did I miss something this morning?" Linda hesitated for only a moment before giving a brief, factual account of the encounter involving Officer Daniel Brooks. She described the broken dishes, the delayed coffee, the public criticism, and Amelia's calm response without exaggeration or anger. Hayes listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he lowered his eyes for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me," he said quietly. "Professionalism goes both directions. The badge represents responsibility before authority." Ethan remained silent throughout the exchange. He neither criticized Brooks nor defended him. Years of military service had taught him that conclusions should never be reached before facts were fully understood. Amelia soon returned carrying a slice of warm apple pie for a customer celebrating her birthday with friends. She joined the laughter around the table for a brief moment before continuing her work, seemingly unaware that everyone in the diner admired the consistency of her kindness even after the difficult morning she had experienced. Hayes watched her for a moment before speaking again, this time almost to himself. Sometimes the strongest people in a room are the ones who never raise their voices. Ethan looked toward his wife with quiet admiration. That has always been true. Outside the front windows, another marked patrol vehicle slowly turned into the parking lot. Amelia did not notice it because she was helping an elderly customer with the front door, but Hayes recognized the cruiser immediately. He glanced toward Ethan, then toward the entrance, realizing that Officer Daniel Brooks had unexpectedly returned to the diner only an hour after leaving. completely unaware that the next conversation would challenge far more than his first impression of the quiet waitress he believed he had already judged. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped through the front door with the same measured stride he had displayed earlier that morning, but this time the atmosphere inside the diner felt noticeably different. Conversations softened for only a moment before continuing naturally. Amelia looked up from the coffee station, offered the same polite smile she gave every customer, and said, "Good morning, officer." There was no trace of bitterness in her voice. Brooks hesitated almost imperceptibly before giving a brief nod. He had returned after realizing he had left an official incident notebook inside the booth where he had eaten breakfast. Before he could walk farther into the dining room, Officer Michael Hayes stood and greeted him. "Daniel," Hayes said, calmly. Brooks acknowledged him with a surprised expression. "Michael, I did not expect to see you here." Hayes smiled lightly. "I stop here whenever I can." Brooks glanced around the diner and finally noticed Ethan sitting quietly across from Amelia. Ethan simply continued drinking his coffee without attempting to join the conversation. Hayes spoke in the same even tone he used during community meetings. "Everything all right this morning?" Brooks answered casually. "Just a misunderstanding with service earlier." Linda, standing behind the register, chose not to interrupt. She believed the truth had a way of revealing itself without unnecessary arguments. Hayes nodded thoughtfully before replying. "I spoke with several people who were here. They all described the same sequence of events." Brooks folded his arms. Meaning the waitress delayed your coffee because she stopped someone from slipping on broken dishes." Brooks remained silent. Hayes continued gently. "Professional judgment matters in every profession, including ours." Amelia quietly approached with Brooks's forgotten notebook in her hand. "Officer, I believe you left this behind." She extended it toward him with both hands. Brooks accepted it, clearly surprised that she had carefully protected something important to him rather than setting it aside carelessly. "Thank you," he said almost automatically. "You are welcome," Amelia replied before turning to help another table without waiting for further conversation. Ethan watched the exchange in complete silence. He had promised himself before entering the diner that he would allow Amelia to decide how she wanted the situation handled. Her dignity belonged to her, not to him. A few moments later, Brooks looked toward Hayes. "Who is the gentleman with her?" Hayes answered without lowering his voice. "That is Ethan Carter." Brooks shrugged slightly. "Her husband?" "Yes." Brooks nodded once, apparently seeing nothing unusual. Hayes took another sip of coffee before adding quietly, "He recently returned from deployment with a Navy Special Operations Unit." Brooks looked toward Ethan again, this time with a little more curiosity than before. Ethan happened to notice the glance and responded with nothing more than a courteous nod. There was no attempt to impress anyone, no mention of military achievements, and no expectation of special treatment. Brooks seemed almost disappointed that the introduction had produced no dramatic reaction. Meanwhile, Amelia continued helping customers exactly as she had all morning. She laughed with a group of retirees celebrating a birthday, carried extra syrup to a family with young children, and helped an elderly woman zip her light jacket before she left. Watching her move through the dining room, Brooks slowly realized something that had escaped him during his first visit. Not one customer appeared uncomfortable around her. In fact, nearly everyone greeted her by name. The respect filling the room had not appeared because of sympathy after the morning's incident. It had existed long before he arrived. As Brooks prepared to leave again, a gray-haired man entering the diner stopped beside him and smiled toward Amelia. "There is my favorite waitress," he said warmly. "I drove 15 miles because nobody serves breakfast quite like you do." Amelia laughed softly and thanked him. Brooks quietly looked around the room once more. For the first time that day, uncertainty replaced certainty. He walked toward the exit carrying his notebook, but instead of opening the door immediately, he paused with his hand on the handle, realizing that perhaps the person he had misjudged that morning was not the waitress at all. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing beside the entrance for another brief moment before quietly turning back toward the dining room. No one seemed surprised to see him return except Brooks himself. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier had been replaced by careful observation. He noticed details that anger had hidden from him before. Amelia thanked every customer with the same warmth regardless of age, background, or appearance. Linda encouraged every employee with quiet patience instead of sharp commands. Even during the busiest moments, the diner felt less like a business and more like a neighborhood gathering place. Brooks slowly walked toward the counter. Amelia looked up and smiled politely. "Did you need anything else, officer?" Her tone was exactly the same as before, free from sarcasm or resentment. Brooks hesitated before answering. "Actually, yes. May I have another cup of coffee?" "Of course," Amelia replied. "Please have a seat. I will bring it right over." She poured a fresh cup, placed it carefully on a clean saucer, and carried it to a nearby booth. Brooks quietly thanked her. The simple exchange felt strangely different from the one that had unfolded only a short time earlier. Ethan watched without saying a word. He recognized that some lessons could not be forced. They had to arrive naturally. Brooks sat alone for several minutes, watching customers greet Amelia by name as they entered. A local firefighter stopped to thank her for remembering his father's dietary restrictions. An elderly widow smiled as Amelia carried her groceries from the front door to her car before returning inside. A teenage cashier from the pharmacy next door waved excitedly because Amelia had once helped him prepare for a job interview. None of those people knew they were changing Brooks's perspective simply by treating Amelia with genuine affection. Hayes finished his coffee and stood to leave. Before placing cash on the counter, he walked over to Brooks. "Daniel," he said quietly, "our uniforms remind people what we represent long before we speak. Every conversation matters." Brooks nodded slowly. "I understand." Hayes gave a respectful nod toward Amelia and Ethan before leaving the diner. Silence settled over Brooks's booth once again. He looked at the steaming coffee for a long moment before finally standing and walking toward Amelia, who was organizing clean menus near the register. "Miss Carter," he began. Amelia turned toward him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the day. Brooks took a careful breath. "I have been thinking about what happened this morning." Amelia listened without interrupting. "I reacted before I understood the situation," Brooks continued. "I assumed the worst instead of asking a simple question. That was unfair." Linda quietly looked up from the register but remained silent. Ethan continued eating the last bite of his breakfast without attempting to join the conversation. This moment belonged to Amelia and Brooks alone. Amelia answered gently. "Everyone has difficult mornings." Brooks shook his head slightly. "That is not an excuse. I wear this badge because people trust me to stay calm before reaching conclusions. I did not do that today." Amelia studied his expression for a moment and saw something she had not seen earlier: humility. Not perfection, not complete transformation, but an honest willingness to admit fault. She offered a small smile. "Thank you for saying that." Brooks seemed relieved by the simple response. "I hope someday I earn the professionalism that you showed this morning." Amelia nodded. "We all have another chance when we choose to learn." Brooks smiled faintly before extending his hand. Amelia accepted it with quiet dignity. There was no applause from the customers, no dramatic speeches, and no celebration. The diner simply returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet something important had changed. Respect had replaced assumption, and understanding had quietly taken the place of pride. Ethan watched his wife from across the room with unmistakable admiration. Once again, she had chosen grace instead of resentment, proving that the strongest victories rarely arrived through confrontation. They arrived when kindness gave another person room to become better. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The quiet handshake between Amelia and Officer Daniel Brooks marked the end of an uncomfortable morning, but life inside Harbor Family Diner continued exactly as it always had. The lunch crowd would arrive within the hour, and there was still coffee to brew, tables to wipe, and fresh soup simmering in the kitchen. Amelia slipped naturally back into her routine, never mentioning the apology to anyone else. She believed sincere words did not need an audience to matter. Ethan stood and gathered their empty plates before carrying them to the service counter despite Linda insisting that customers never cleared their own dishes. "Old habit," Ethan said with a smile. "Everybody pitches in." Linda laughed. "You sound exactly like Amelia." "That is because I learned from her," he answered. Amelia looked at him with quiet affection before returning to greet another family entering the diner. Brooks remained near the front door for another moment before walking back toward Ethan. "Sir," he said respectfully, "Officer Hayes mentioned your military service. Thank you for serving our country." Ethan nodded appreciatively. "Thank you for serving our community." Brooks hesitated before speaking again. "I hope you do not think less of law enforcement because of my mistake today." Ethan answered calmly. "Every profession has people who have difficult moments. One person's actions should never define everyone else." Brooks absorbed the words in thoughtful silence. They sounded remarkably similar to the lesson he had just experienced himself. Ethan continued, "The important part is what someone chooses after recognizing a mistake." Brooks nodded slowly. "I understand that much better now." As Brooks stepped outside, he paused beside his patrol vehicle instead of getting in immediately. Through the diner window, he watched Amelia laughing with a little girl who proudly showed her a drawing made with crayons while waiting for lunch. Amelia admired the picture as though it belonged in an art gallery instead of on a paper placemat. The little girl's smile grew even brighter. Brooks realized that kindness like hers could never be measured by a single interaction. It revealed itself through hundreds of ordinary moments that most people never noticed. Back inside, Ethan checked the time on his watch. "I need to report to the base this afternoon for debriefing," he said quietly. Amelia smiled with understanding. Military schedules had shaped their marriage for years. Every reunion carried the awareness that duty never paused for long. "I know," she replied. "I am just grateful we could have breakfast together." Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a small polished challenge coin on the table. One side displayed an eagle above an anchor, while the other carried a simple inscription about honor, humility, and service. "Keep this with you," he said. Amelia looked at it with surprise. "I thought you always carried this." Ethan smiled. "I did. Today I think it belongs with the person who reminded me what those words really look like." Amelia carefully closed her fingers around the coin, touched by the gesture more than any expensive gift could have been. Linda happened to notice from across the room and quietly smiled without interrupting them. A few minutes later, Ethan stood, hugged Amelia warmly, thanked Linda once again for breakfast, and shook hands with several regular customers before walking toward the parking lot. As he climbed into his truck, Brooks happened to drive past the diner on routine patrol. Their eyes met briefly through opposite windows. Ethan simply raised 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a courteous wave. Brooks returned the gesture with genuine respect before continuing down Main Street. Amelia watched both vehicles disappear in different directions, thinking about how unexpectedly the morning had unfolded. What had begun with misunderstanding had ended with humility, forgiveness, and a deeper appreciation for the quiet strength that ordinary people carried into everyday life. She slipped Ethan's challenge coin safely into her apron pocket, took one steady breath, straightened the stack of menus beside the register, and welcomed the next customer through the door with the very same kindness that had quietly transformed everyone around her. The lunch hour arrived with its familiar rhythm as Harbor Family Diner filled once again with teachers, construction workers, office employees, retirees, and families enjoying an ordinary weekday meal. Outside, the autumn sun stood higher over Norfolk, Virginia, while a cool breeze carried scattered golden leaves across the parking lot. Inside, the scent of fresh vegetable soup, grilled sandwiches, and homemade cornbread blended with quiet conversations that made the small diner feel like the heart of the neighborhood. Amelia slipped Ethan's challenge coin securely into the small zippered pocket inside her apron before greeting another group of customers with her usual warm smile. She did not think about the difficult morning anymore. There were too many people waiting to be served with kindness for her to dwell on what had already passed. Linda noticed Amelia's peaceful expression and smiled to herself. She had owned the diner for nearly 20 years, and she had learned that the strongest employees were not always the loudest ones. They were the people who quietly made everyone else feel welcome. Just after noon, the telephone behind the register rang. Linda answered with her usual cheerful greeting, listened for several moments, then looked toward Amelia. "That was the elementary school down the street," she said after hanging up. "Their cafeteria refrigerator stopped working. They asked if we could spare a few gallons of milk until their emergency delivery arrives this afternoon." Without hesitation, Amelia answered, "Of course we can." Linda nodded. "I knew you would say that." Together, they gathered several containers from the walk-in refrigerator, while one of the cooks helped load them into insulated boxes. Linda called the school back to confirm everything was ready. You know, Linda said while closing one of the lids, we will probably lose money on this. Amelia smiled gently. The children still need lunch. Linda laughed softly. That is exactly why I asked you instead of looking at the accounting book. A young employee volunteered to deliver the supplies immediately. Several customers quietly watched the small act of generosity unfold. None of it was announced. No photographs were taken. No one expected recognition. Helping simply felt like the natural thing to do. Meanwhile, several miles away, Officer Daniel Brooks continued his afternoon patrol through the downtown streets. His thoughts repeatedly returned to the conversation inside the diner. Every traffic stop, every call, and every conversation reminded him of something Ethan had said. One person's actions should never define everyone else. The sentence carried more weight than Brooks expected. He realized that he had judged Amelia before understanding her actions, just as people sometimes unfairly judged entire professions after one negative experience. The lesson worked both ways. Near 1 o'clock, his radio crackled with a routine dispatch requesting assistance directing traffic around a disabled delivery truck blocking part of an intersection near the elementary school. Brooks acknowledged the call and drove toward the location. When he arrived, school staff members were already working together with volunteers to safely move supplies away from the roadway. Among the boxes waiting near the entrance, Brooks noticed several insulated containers clearly labeled with the Harbor Family Diner logo. A school employee smiled with relief while speaking to another volunteer. If the diner had not helped us so quickly, hundreds of children would have gone without milk at lunch today. Brooks quietly looked at the containers for several seconds. No newspaper reporters stood nearby. No cameras recorded the delivery. The diner had helped simply because someone needed help. He found himself smiling for the first time that day. Back at the diner, Amelia continued serving customers without knowing where the donated supplies had gone or whether anyone even knew they had come from Harbor Family Diner. She simply thanked each guest, refilled coffee cups before they became empty, and treated every person who walked through the front door with the same steady respect. The challenge coin rested safely inside her apron pocket, its smooth edge gently brushing against her hand each time she reached for an order pad, quietly reminding her that true honor was never measured by titles, uniforms, or recognition, but by the choices people made when no one expected anything in return. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the front windows of Harbor Family Diner as the lunch crowd slowly gave way to a quieter part of the day. The constant rhythm of plates, coffee cups, and friendly greetings softened into comfortable silence. Amelia carried a fresh pot of coffee from table to table, stopping to ask every customer whether they needed anything before they had to ask themselves. The challenge coin Ethan had given her remained safely inside her apron pocket, and each time her hand brushed against it, she remembered his simple words about honor and service. She smiled quietly, knowing those values belonged to ordinary days just as much as extraordinary ones. Linda finished balancing the lunch receipts and looked around the dining room with satisfaction. Looks like we survived another busy day, she said with a light laugh. Amelia smiled. There is still plenty of time for surprises. Neither of them realized how true those words would become. A little after 2 o'clock, Officer Michael Hayes returned to the diner after completing his afternoon patrol. He removed his campaign hat, greeted Linda warmly, and ordered a cup of black coffee before taking his usual booth near the front window. Amelia brought his coffee with the same cheerful professionalism she showed every customer. How did everything go at the school? She asked after noticing the dust on his boots. Hayes smiled. The children all had lunch because someone here decided helping was more important than keeping inventory. Linda waved dismissively from behind the register. We only did what anybody should do. Hayes gently shook his head. Not everybody would have. Amelia simply smiled and returned to another table before the conversation could continue. A few minutes later, the front door opened once again. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside, no longer carrying the hurried posture that had defined him earlier that morning. He removed his hat before entering, looked around the room, and walked directly toward Linda at the register. Do you have a minute? He asked politely. Of course, Linda replied. Brooks placed a folded envelope on the counter. This is payment for everyone's breakfast this morning, including the veteran who quietly covered part of my bill after I left. I spoke with him this afternoon after locating him through the community center. He refused to take the money back. He asked me to leave it here instead and told me to use it for someone who might need a meal. Linda looked at the envelope without opening it. That was thoughtful of both of you. Brooks nodded. I also wanted to ask if you have a community meal board. Linda smiled and pointed toward a corkboard near the register where handwritten notes read, "Meal already paid for." Anyone in need could quietly remove one without questions or embarrassment. Brooks looked at the board for several seconds before adding several meal cards purchased with the money inside the envelope. Please put these toward anyone who could use a warm lunch. Amelia quietly witnessed the exchange from across the room, but chose not to interrupt. She understood that some acts of kindness carried more meaning when they remained simple. Hayes watched the moment unfold with quiet approval. Brooks then walked toward Amelia. "Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "I wanted you to know that today reminded me why humility matters as much as confidence. Thank you for accepting my apology this morning." Amelia answered with the same calm kindness that had carried her through the entire day. "I believe people deserve the chance to become better after they recognize a mistake." Brooks smiled gratefully. "I hope I continue earning that chance." Amelia nodded. "So do I." There was no dramatic speech, no audience waiting to applaud, and no grand declaration that everything had suddenly become perfect. Instead, the diner simply welcomed another customer through the front door, another coffee pot began brewing in the kitchen, and another ordinary afternoon continued. Yet everyone present quietly understood that something meaningful had happened. Pride had slowly given way to humility, assumptions had been replaced by understanding, and one person's decision to answer disrespect with dignity had quietly inspired another person to serve the community with greater compassion than before. By late afternoon, long bands of golden sunlight stretched across the polished floor of Harbor Family Diner, giving the small restaurant a peaceful warmth that only arrived at the end of a busy day. The lunch rush had passed, leaving only a handful of regular customers lingering over coffee and quiet conversations. Amelia moved through the dining room with the same calm energy she had carried since sunrise. Nothing about her manner suggested she had experienced one of the most emotionally demanding mornings of her life. She greeted every guest with the same welcoming smile, thanked every customer sincerely, and never allowed one painful moment to define the rest of her day. Linda stepped out of the kitchen carrying a fresh pie and placed it carefully inside the display case. "I think we have earned a slower afternoon," she said with a relieved smile. Amelia laughed softly. "I will not argue with that." Just then the front door opened, and the retired school principal who had defended Amelia earlier that morning returned with two neatly dressed high school students. "Good afternoon," he called cheerfully. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," Linda replied warmly. "Welcome back." The principal introduced the students as members of a local youth leadership program that encouraged volunteer service throughout the community. They were gathering stories about everyday people who quietly made their neighborhood stronger. One of the students looked toward Amelia. "Sir told us about what happened this morning," she said respectfully. "He also told us how you responded." Amelia immediately shook her head with gentle humility. "There are many people in this town who deserve recognition more than I do." The principal smiled knowingly. "That answer is exactly why I brought them here." The students asked if they could simply observe the diner for a few minutes while taking notes about community leadership. Amelia agreed as long as they did not interfere with customers. For the next half hour, they quietly watched something that surprised them. They saw Amelia carry an extra chair to an elderly customer before he asked. They watched Linda prepare a takeout meal for a widow recovering from surgery and quietly write paid on the receipt before sealing the bag. They noticed Amelia greeting a sanitation worker with the same respect she showed the local business owners who stopped by every afternoon. There were no speeches, no cameras, and no announcements. Kindness appeared in small choices repeated over and over until they became part of everyday life. One student finally whispered to the principal, "Nobody here is trying to impress anyone." He smiled gently. "Exactly. Character is what people choose when they believe nobody important is watching." Amelia happened to overhear those words while pouring fresh coffee into a customer's cup. She instinctively touched the challenge coin resting inside her apron pocket and thought of Ethan. Honor, humility, and service. Those values suddenly felt much bigger than military words engraved on polished metal. They belonged inside classrooms, restaurants, patrol cars, construction sites, hospitals, and every ordinary place where people met one another each day. Before leaving, the students thanked Amelia for allowing them to visit. One of them hesitated before speaking. "I used to think leadership meant being the loudest person in the room," he admitted. "Today I learned it can also mean being the calmest." Amelia smiled warmly. Sometimes kindness gives people permission to become kinder themselves. The principal nodded with quiet satisfaction as they stepped outside. Through the front windows, Amelia watched them continue down the sidewalk, discussing everything they had seen. She realized they would probably remember this ordinary afternoon much longer than they remembered any formal lesson. Linda joined her beside the window for a brief moment. "You know," she said softly, "I think your husband was right this morning." Amelia looked at her curiously. Linda smiled. "Strength does not always look like power. Sometimes it looks exactly like choosing kindness again after someone has already tested your patience." Amelia looked around the peaceful diner filled with familiar faces and quietly understood that forgiveness had not changed only one person's heart that day. It had quietly reached everyone who had witnessed it, leaving behind something far more lasting than the misunderstanding that had first brought them together. As evening settled over Norfolk, Virginia, the last rays of sunlight faded into a gentle amber glow that reflected across the front windows of Harbor Family Diner. The steady rhythm of the day slowly gave way to quiet routines. Chairs were turned upside down onto freshly cleaned tables one by one. The coffee makers were emptied, and the familiar scent of fresh bread lingered in the air long after the final customers had gone home. Amelia wiped the last booth near the window where Ethan had shared breakfast with her only hours earlier. It felt impossible that everything had happened within a single day. The spilled coffee, the misunderstanding, the apology, the unexpected reunion, and the countless quiet reminders that kindness often reached farther than anyone realized now blended together like chapters of one long lesson. Linda finished locking the cash register before walking beside Amelia. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "I have owned this place for almost 20 years. I have seen arguments, celebrations, weddings, reunions, and people saying goodbye to loved ones before deployments. But today reminded me why this little diner has always mattered." Amelia looked around the peaceful room. "Because people come here hungry?" she asked with a playful smile. Linda laughed softly. "Sometimes for food. Sometimes for something much harder to find." Amelia nodded thoughtfully. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one after another, casting long reflections across the nearly empty parking lot. She reached into her apron pocket and gently held Ethan's challenge coin in her hand. The polished surface had already become warm from resting there throughout the day. She quietly read the words engraved along its edge once again. Honor, humility, service. They no longer felt like distant ideals connected only to military life. They had become choices made in ordinary moments by ordinary people. Just before closing, the front door opened one final time. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside wearing plain clothes instead of his uniform. In one hand, he carried a small paper bag from the local bakery across the street. "I hope I am not too late," he said with a modest smile. Linda looked at the clock. "We are technically closed, but come on in." Brooks walked over to Amelia. "I brought dessert for everyone working tonight. It is nothing special. I simply wanted to end today better than I started it." Amelia accepted the bag with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. That is very thoughtful." Brooks smiled quietly. "I spent a long time thinking after I left here. Today reminded me that authority earns trust only when it is guided by humility." He paused before continuing. "I cannot change the way this morning began, but I can choose how tomorrow begins." Amelia nodded warmly. "That is all any of us can do." Brooks shook hands with Linda before leaving the diner one final time. There was no audience, no dramatic farewell, and no perfect ending that erased every mistake. There was only one person choosing to become better because another person had answered disrespect with grace instead of resentment. After locking the front door, Amelia stepped outside into the cool evening air. Across the quiet parking lot, Ethan's pickup truck waited to take her home after finishing his reporting at the base. He leaned casually against the driver's door with the same calm smile that had greeted her that morning. Amelia walked toward him, and without saying a word, slipped her hand into his. Together they looked back once at the softly glowing diner windows before driving away beneath the autumn sky. Inside the empty restaurant, The lights reflected gently against the polished floor where the morning's spilled coffee had long since been cleaned away. Nothing remained of the misunderstanding except the quiet changes it had left behind. One officer had rediscovered humility. One community had witnessed the strength of compassion. One husband had watched the woman he loved choose dignity over anger. And one waitress, who never sought recognition, had reminded everyone around her that kindness was never weakness. It was the quiet courage that changed hearts when nothing else could. She did not change the whole world that day. She simply changed one heart, then another, and that was more than enough. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what is right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We will see you in the next story.